Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about democratizing art. What I mean by this is trying to think a little bit about how we can take art that is often seen as removed and separate from the public and actually build connections to think about it as something that we all have connection to. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about a few different things. One is the question generally of, is everybody an artist? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the arguments for that perspective and some of the arguments that argue that that is something separate. I'm also going to talk a little bit about elitism in art and the ways in which art has excluded certain groups for a long period of time, and just touch on that to consider that. Then I'll talk a little bit about some movements that are just some of many examples of how art can be democratized. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about political art and what political art is and how some different ways that people think about that approach to doing things. And then finally, I'm going to give some examples of climate change art because I want to build that connection as we move forward. So before I start off, I should just note here that a lot of this lecture is going to focus a little bit more on painting and drawings and sculpture and some performance art, not because the ideas I'm talking about aren't relevant to all arts, but because those are arts I'm a little bit more familiar with. All right. So the idea of is everybody is an artist, right? That's actually a quote from Joseph Beuys, where he actually was really trying to promote the idea that everybody can be engaged with art. And here's a quote by him. I think it's kind of a nice illustration of this. The idea that creativity is not limited to people practicing one of the traditional forms of art. And even in the case of artists, creativity is not confined to the exercise of their art. Each one of us has a creative potential, which is hidden by competitiveness and success aggression. All right. So each of us has a creative potential. So really promoting the idea that everybody has this creative ability to go out and create some sort of artistic expression. And I think the other thing that's noted here is that idea of competitiveness and creative and success aggression, which is the idea that many of us have been put off from doing art because of that competitiveness that we've experienced throughout our lives. I'll note here that we all know that everybody has some forms of artistic taste that they express. So do you have an Instagram account? Well, that's a form of curation of expressing our interests. Do you have favorite films? Well, you might like different performers better or not, or different types of subjects better or not. Do you like specific types of music? What types of things you use to decorate your house? We all have this ability to recognize what we like and dislike. And in some ways, we often do that as consumers of art, but there's no reason that we also can't express those interests and desires and creativity as artists ourselves. The patron saint of my generation for the idea of everybody can do art is Bob Ross. So some of you, he's had a resurgence in terms of attention lately. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention him. But he's this just really nice painter who did this show where he showed everybody the joy of painting. And he would just show these simple ways of doing these really nice, sweet landscape art paintings. And he's known for a lot of different quotes, but I generally find them very inspiring. So, one idea, let your imagination run wild and let your heart be your guide. Like the idea of really allowing that creativity to come out. And then he sort of addresses the idea that people feel like they can't do it. And he says, people continuously say, I don't have a talent to do what you're doing. And he says, that's baloney. Talent is a pursued interest, right? So what he's saying here is art is a practice. If you're pursuing it as an interest, then you're practicing art. And he also really wanted to move his audience away from the idea that I have to be perfect, right? So he said, we don't make mistakes, we just make happy little accidents, right? So his view of this is, give it a try, enjoy it, experience that joy, and don't let yourself get too worried about doing something right or not, or whether you're doing fine art or not. So these are just some of the ideas that really try and make art more accessible. So there are also some arguments that say, well, not everybody is an artist. And I just want to talk about that idea because I think it's also illustrative and it's a helpful way of thinking as we go forward. And this is sometimes referred to as boundary work. It's the idea of, does a profession have a specific scope, or can everybody say that they're that thing? So would you say that anyone who cares for somebody else could call themselves a nurse? Probably not, right? Because there's a distinct profession of nursing that has a wide set of criteria around it. Or somebody went out to try and figure out where disease came from. So I said, oh, I found out that I got this cold from Bob. Well, does that make me an epidemiologist? Well, probably not. By the same token, one could ask, is everyone who creates art of some sort, are they an artist? Now, let's remind ourselves here that art is not just a practice of producing and creating something. There's also ways in which we can remember that art is embedded in this long history of different types of ideas and traditions, right? So this is just a word cloud showing a bunch of the different types of art movements throughout history, and there's many of them. And when artists do their art who've devoted a lot of time to this, they usually identify themselves within a lot of these traditions. And that's actually can be important to what their art says, because sometimes art is important not just because of how pretty it is or some other characteristic like that. It's also what it says to the field and what it means to that practice of art and those movements. So another view here of that more hardline stance for doing that boundary work would be, a view that says that an artist is someone who sacrifices for their art, popularity, fame, to hold the integrity of the ideas. And if you're not sacrificing, you don't count as an artist, right? So another perspective. And I think something that is worthwhile in these perspectives is just the idea that people who are professionally artists, they've spent a lot of time training. This is countless hours of the studio, and they really think about those conversations within the field and the way that their art influences the direction forwards and how that field develops. So, it's worth valuing their artists as professionals and what they're doing, and recognizing that we can learn from them and learn from those experts in artistic fields, right? What I'd say here is, for the purposes of what I'm doing in this course and what I'm trying to talk about, the purpose of this course is really to encourage creativity and the ways in which we can take and examine all this amazing diversity of art that's out there and try and learn from it, right? So I would also just say that art and artistry, one could view it as lying on the continuum from people who are experimenting with it and playing with it and those ideas to people who devote their entire lives to it. And that's entirely fine. And it really should not in any way deter people who are excited about art from exercising that creativity. And as we go forward in this course, the real goal for me is to just demystify art and to inspire us to feel engaged, to want to connect with that art. So again, that connection has benefits, right? So we don't want to neglect the real beauty of engaging with art, right? So for one thing, when we think about ourselves as health professionals, for example, a lot of our courses and a lot of the things that we encounter really thinks about rational thinking, critical thinking, having that logical approach. But we often forget in that the real importance of associative thinking, right? So we know that many of the prominent people in our fields are the people who actually don't just go through things logically, but they have these inspired leaps and these creative connections that they build. And in some ways, this critical thinking and rational thinking is very good for combining ideas in a certain sort of way and creating arguments. but it might not be the best thing for building associative thinking, of building connections between fields and between ideas. And there's a lot of evidence that art and the practice of art actually is good for helping us have those associative ideas, and some research supports that. We also know that art is used in therapy all the time, so we know that connects to the ways that we can actually deal with stress in some ways, or handle sadness of the different stressors that we're dealing with. And it can also help us to think through our ideas, sometimes remotely and through that associative process. It's also kind of a nice way of mindfulness or meditative practice, which can help us build our focus and help develop flow in the way that we do things. I also wouldn't neglect the ways in which art is really important for building connections. So art can exist in community, and I'll talk a little bit about participating community art, but it can be a really fun way to connect with others and to enjoy thinking about something with others in that representative way. And I also think at a deeper level, we all have that desire and energy and excitement and inspiration to create in some form. And I like the idea of helping us to nurture that and support that, that enjoyment and joy. So, all right. So I want to talk a little bit, when we're thinking about democratizing art, just say a few words about the ways in which barriers are sometimes built into art, so that we can think about ways to critique that and think around that. All right. So there is this idea of the art canon. All right. The art canon is like the traditional pieces of art that are seen as being central to art history. Right. Now, one thing about this canon is that it's what is enshrined in galleries and museums very often. It often feels remote, like something that we don't sometimes connect to or can't afford. If you go into a gallery like this, I can't afford anything like this. And what's seen as being good or not good sometimes is very puzzling to me, and I don't feel like I'm engaged in that conversation. And, you know, that's okay. Sometimes this conversation is happening in ways that I don't know, and that's all right. But it's important to note that there is a certain elitism and disconnect between what might exist in that very money-driven art world and what might be a more representative understanding of creativity and artistry. Right. So we have this idea of the pretentious art critic, right? You know, the one that has these very obscure ideas and very complex ways of viewing things that lead to art that it just is obscurantist, right, and doesn't connect with us. And this is a world that doesn't feel connected for many people. Now, one of the reasons that this doesn't feel connected is that it often does not represent a wide range of human experience. So one of the things that we often don't acknowledge in this canon of work that is seen as being central is that a very large majority of the people who are seen as being that canon are historically white men. Right? So I'll just give you some examples here. There's a textbook, History of Art by H.W. Jansen, that has been used for a very long time. It's gone through many iterations. And that textbook, until 1987, did not include a single female artist in that textbook, right? So that just gives you an idea of how closed a view might have existed in that canon of historical art, right? That was seen as being what the history of art actually is, right? And this type of exclusion of women is very common. Kasama, an artist that we are probably familiar from the Mirrors exhibits and the ones that you see all over Instagram, very beautiful. in her early work in New York City, for example, when she was a young female artist, she came up with a lot of brilliant ideas. And she was eventually pushed out of that scene because she would come up with an idea, and some more famous male artists would just steal that idea and become famous off of her work, right? So there's many ways in which the structure of the field actually discouraged that representation. Exclusion also, exists with respect to race, and exists with respect to many different dynamics of marginalization, but I'm just giving a few examples here. With respect to race, just a few weeks ago, I was at the Met and I was going through the modern art wing, and I was walking along and I saw a piece of art which was looked like a piece of African art, and I was excited. I went over to see it because everything prior to that had seemed to be from Western white artists. So I go up to the piece of art and then look at the name, and I find out that as a famous impressionist, right? A white man who had seen African art and decided to do African style art, and there's benefits to being inspired by other people's art, but at bottom line, it's his art that's worth millions of dollars in hanging in a museum, and not the African artists that he was inspired by. And here's just an example from Ernst Ludwig Kirchner of African-inspired art that uses principles and ideas, right? But again, maintain that monopoly of the white artist. KERRY James Marshall is an African-American artist who has really been thinking about this a lot. And one of the things that he says is none of the people represented in this canon really represent the really amazing and wonderful African-American artists that African artists that he was inspired by. And here you see a piece of art, untitled piece of art, where you see African American people in a museum looking at art, and it's not explicitly stated, but there is that tension and question as to what is that experience of observation, especially in the larger context that he describes of lack of representation. The other thing that you can note here, again, is getting back to the idea of money, right? So I talked about the expense and the elitism within art. And some of his work also points to the sheer expense of much of the art that exists in these galleries and auctions for art that are astronomical. And he'll point to the fact that there's of the four major auction houses, only one of them regularly has African-American focused art auctions. And if you look at the actual prices of the art, and he does art showing this, they tend to be substantially lower, right? So we talk about the ways that money sort of reflects this marginalization in art. There are, of course, a conversation within art. Artists have this very complex relationship to money and to power, where many artists feel a need to be separate, but yet in many ways, in order to survive and make money that they need to exist as artists, they need to interact with this elite. And you will see that conversation and that debate happening constantly within art fields about how to mean authenticity in the context of this money. Now, remember, the amount of money in this is really important. So when we're looking at a museum, the boards of these museums, the donors to these museums, are often astronomically rich, multimillionaires, sometimes billionaires, right? And you can't help but think that the people who are in charge of these museums and help guide the direction of these museums influences what's actually shown. So this is often commented on in the sense that artwork that is critical of the rich, for example, there aren't a whole lot of exhibits that actually represent this type of critical artwork. So there's ways in which that money can influence a conversation that is actually happening in the art world based upon what is actually seen. So Banksy is a graffiti artist who's gotten a lot of attention recently for his political art. And this is just an example of some of the pushback that occurs against elitism within the art world. So he did a piece of artwork called Girl with a Balloon that was in this golden frame. And it went up for auction in 2018, very recently. And what was kind of interesting is he had sort of planned ahead for this possibility. So it went up for auction. It sold, I think, for $1.4 million. And the moment, seconds after it was sold, a shredder activated within the frame of this art and shredded the piece of artwork. Now, it shredded it partway through, and it was renamed Love is in the Bin. That was actually an accident. It was supposed to shred the whole thing, but it was intended to essentially be a criticism of the elite art scene. And you see here people watching in horror as that piece that just sold for $1.4 million is being shredded. So there is that conversation that occurs within the art field around money in art. Now, remember, art begets art. There is this interactive thing within art. And I just kind of like this. As I was looking at some of these examples, here's just a picture of climate art, which is criticizing the elite and the rich, and showing the IPCC climate report that was not really given the attention that it needed through the news and political in political circles, using the same sort of concept that Banksy used, right? So I think one of the things I'm trying to get at here by talking about representation, by talking about money, by talking about how this exists and that those tensions that exist within art fields, is just to remind us that when we feel like we're being told what is valuable art or what is good art, there's actually a really important thing to step back and pay attention to our own opinions, how we feel about this. Much of what is seen as being valuable art is coming out of that tradition, which has not had the representation that we would like to see, which has not had which is very much dominated by certain commercial forces, right? And there's ways in which we can actually resist that. I will also note, just when it comes to power and defining what is art, I as an instructor will have opinions, and I'm trying to have an open view towards art, but there might be times where you disagree with me about what counts as art or how I'm describing art. And that's okay, and that's a positive thing. I want you to do that. And we can, of course, talk about that. So remember that having your own opinion, valuing your own opinion, being part of this conversation is a form of empowerment and actually resistance to these forces of marginalization. All right, so I think it's kind of fun to talk a little bit about democratizing movements within art that are trying to push against this elitism, or opening up art to more people, right? Making it more of a public process where everybody's engaged. And I think one form of art that's kind of fun to talk about in this is outsider art. This is the attention to art that is produced by people who actually have not been connected to the art field, but produce really amazing artwork that is presenting many of the ideas that exist within the art field, but was independently generated. So Georgiana HOUGHTON did what she called spirit drawings in the 1816s to 1870s, about 50 years before the abstract art movements were trying to do that sort of work. And her ideas and her foundation and the artwork that she produced, which is clearly beautiful, really preceded what a lot of the men who later did this were doing. So sometimes art is done by people outside of the art field that just isn't recognized, right? Another example here is James Castle, who was a poor deaf man who lived in Boise, Idaho, who created thousands of pieces of art, was entirely self-taught, just using soot and spit basically to draw on paper. And he just made volumes and volumes of work, books and other things. And some of the work that he was doing was actually very much reflective of abstract art and sometimes pop art that followed. For example, some of it, his matchbox drawings, sort of had similar ideas to what Warhol later did that influenced art fields. So sometimes people have these ideas, fascinating ideas, that just don't fit within the mainstream art field and get discovered later on, and that they can be pulled into the field and recognized for what they've done. There's also craft arts. So increasingly there's attention to crafts as a form of art. Here's just an example I saw at the Biennale, which is knitted coral reefs to sort of recognize and pay attention to coral reefs. And there's lots of different things that are crafts that are done by people all over the world. And crafts are very often understood to be done by people of all different backgrounds, and very often done by poor people. And this is something that increasingly these types of works are recognized not just as marginalized as crafts as less valuable, but also as art and creativity and that human expression. There's also community and participatory art. This is a way of doing art that is political, that recognizes that art doesn't have to be an individual exercise by a genius hidden away in the studio. It can also be a form of connection that we bring people together to make something together. Here's a piece of art that a community came together to create. Participatory art specifically is art that it wouldn't be the same without people actually being part of that art. That by its very nature requires people to engage with that art, to connect with it, and to help build it. Right? So sometimes that can be an amazing thing for actually helping build that connection and making the art even more powerful. Another example is prison art. There's a whole prison art movement to try and think about providing an opportunity for people who haven't been trained in the arts to actually express themselves and be creative. And, there's multiple reasons for that, therapeutic and otherwise, but as a way of both political expression, but also as a way of people working through and thinking about their lives and where they've been. Right. So, and that is another form of public democratized art that is getting a lot of attention. There's also graffiti art. Graffiti art is a fascinating story, right? Where in the 60s and 70s, when it came out, it was seen as being messy, as against the law, criminalized, and now it's transitioned so that's very much respected. And remember, a lot of these arts, again, talking about that interaction with race, were discriminated against because of the people who were doing graffiti art, right? So, these are some examples of art that is done by everybody, that is done in public for everybody, by everybody, and that there isn't this sort of control over that field and scope of that field. All right. I think an interesting example, particularly here in the Pacific Northwest, where this is very popular, I'm sure you've all heard of Burning Man. So this is an interesting movement in the sense that it's an event that occurs once a year that brings people together. And one of the sort of principles of it, ethics of it, is that everybody can do art and everybody should be able to express themselves creatively. And this is sort of an interesting thing where this art has actually started to influence, or has actually for a long time, increasingly influenced pop culture. So that now if you see a movie that, for example, has some sort of post-apocalyptic future, very often it will look a lot like the art or the styles of art that you see at Burning Man, right? So there's ways in which this sort of approach to community art, wherein very often camps are formed together where people, groups of 20, 30 more people come together to actually build a piece of art together, can actually be recognized and appreciated in larger circles. Now, these community arts, these ways of democratizing art, still have an interaction with those commercial forces and mainstream or what we call insider art. So, for example, you can go to galleries now to see graffiti art, which is selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars, right? So these are, there's ways in which what has become, what was more of a practice that was done by the public starts to become part of the canon in some ways. You also have Burning Man. Here's another example. This is a picture from a museum exhibit of Burning Man art where it's pulled in. So this is an interesting relationship where artists and the public produces art and then has this conversation with how that exists. And in some ways it's positive because people can make money off of their art. And then there's other concerns that come into this around how that money is influencing what art is produced. Particularly in public spaces or spaces that where the goal was to do this in a way that it wasn't influenced by market forces. All right, so let's turn our attention to political art. So what is political art? Well, there's a range of different ways of thinking about this. I'm going to use one sort of way of defining this, which is thinking about political art as doing essentially one of three things. One is trying to describe or portray to the audience what is going on with the social situation, right? Just to let people know that this is occurring, right? Another thing that political art could be doing is promote a certain solution, right? A political solution to a problem, okay? And another is to provide a vision for the future, to project so that we can imagine a possibility for steps forward to change society to achieve a goal, right? So that's some of the definition, sort of a way of thinking about what political art might look like. Now, political art has existed forever. It has, substantial potential to sort of subvert and influence culture. So I'll just give you an example that I learned about when I was a student, which was French fairy tales. And there were, this occurred during the 1600s, where there was a fairly oppressive monarchy in France, where you couldn't actually directly challenge the king, because if you did, you'd be put in prison or possibly killed. So there came to be a salon movement where people got together and wrote stories about essentially fairy tales. And these fairy tales were essentially cloaked critiques of the monarchy, but they were cloaked so they gave plausible deniability to the artists, to the writers who produce these stories, right? So art can be a way of providing critique, yet having some remove there, all right? Now, one thing I'll note about the subversive potential of art is that it really can go both ways, right? It's not necessarily true that the way that political art pushes us is necessarily a positive direction. So, for example, Futurism was a style of art that really supported nationalism, that supported violence as a solution to problems. And this, supported a fascist approach to art at that time in Italy. So, art can have different implications, and political art can lead us in different directions depending on who it's targeting and how it's targeting. Now, political art is still, is something that is still risky. This is work by WEIWEI, who's an artist in China, who has produced a range of art that's critical of the government. And this is a piece of art where he has a column which supports a surveillance camera, which is a replica of the surveillance cameras that are pointed at a studio by the government, right, to watch him, and he ended up being put in jail for about 80 days for his artwork. So it can be dangerous and scary, and there are organizations that exist to actually support people who are being politically persecuted for the art that they're doing. Another example that's fascinating that I went to, which was really amazing and powerful for me, was Shilpa Gupta put together a participatory art project where she took the works of 100 different poets who had been imprisoned for the poetry that they wrote, and people could come in and read those poems into microphones, and it would play on a loop and echo through the room as over time. And there was a very contemplative way of reflecting on the experience of those people who had suffered for the art that they produced. Another much, especially as we go forward to talk about climate art, there's also what we call activist and protest art. And this is also a democratized form of art where we aim to, typically it aims to inform people about an issue. Sometimes it's aiming to persuade people about something. Very often it tries to get people, inspire people to be emotional about a topic. A lot of the protest art is fairly cheap. It's not designed to be a very expensive piece that would go into a art gallery, right? It can be printed on flyers, for example. Often, a lot of this protest art is just made by the public, right? So you and me can produce that. Now, one of the things that we think about when we think about political art is how does it feel? What is it? How does it express those politics? So is it taking it directly on, right on the nose, or is it doing something in a more subtle way? So Barbara KRUGER is a political artist. Starting in the 70s, this piece is from the 1990s. And this is, her work is very much almost like essentially memes, right? So very short statements that just very quickly get at an idea, right? To push the audience to think about some political issue. Okay. This is another piece of art which is produced by JR, and it's a picture of a 1-year-old who lives in Tijuana, KIKITO. And you see that it's this large picture that's just looming over the border fence, looking over at soldiers on the other side, right? And this is a piece of art that's clearly, you can tell it has a political element, but you actually have to sit and think about it. So it's a little bit, I would say, that's slower to figure out what exactly is the artist saying and how is he saying it to try and express what is going on with that border, right? So political art can be very direct, or it can take more time to try and figure out what's going on there. Now, why is this important, the speed at which someone can understand political art? Well, this partially gets to some of the critiques of political art. Some people really are troubled by political art as a way of doing things. So I'll give you an example of this criticism. J.F. Martel wrote a book called Reclaiming Art. And one of the things that was argued essentially was that we are really born with the ability to create and express and imagine. And this is a human ability that is really beautiful, that really leads us to be able to do art. And that's sort of the pure expression of art by this argument. In this argument, art should not follow politics. So you shouldn't have a political idea and then produce art to prove that political idea or to fall in line with an ideology. Because by that point of view, you're undermining that genuine expression of wanting to be creative and imaginative. You're essentially degrading art to be propaganda. Or if you're doing it, creating art, for example, to make money, then it's just essentially an advertisement. So the idea of creating art in that form is essentially that it's mainly aiming just to manipulate the audience and control the audience. It's not really trying to be a genuine expression which uses complex ideas like metaphor to try and explain a complex idea. And very often when we think about the timing, whether something's just a very quick meme that is more along those lines of a direct statement versus something that's a more complex and quietly subversive thing. Very often from these points of critique, the art is seen as being less of an authentic expression of artistry, right? So there are some artists that are really pushing back against the idea that political art would be art. Now, what I would say here is that this is a debate that's sort of ongoing. It's going to continue. And I think it's worthwhile considering that, you know, when does art become contrived, right? When does it start to feel like it's not being sincere or expressing a certain way? And that's going to be a judgment call on all of our parts. But I think it's important to note, or at least to me, that very often the political and political expressions is very much a genuine expression of internal expression and creativity and insight. Because many people, especially people who are marginalized, politics is inherent to them. You know, when you're marginalized or when you're facing a risk like climate change, it actually is a genuine expression. So interesting conversation, something we're thinking about as we think about political art in the context of climate change. So let's talk a little bit about climate change art. There's a wide variety out there, and you know, I'm not going to really try and cover all of that. We're going to work on that throughout the term, but just to give a sampling, I think that there's some interesting art that's engaged, like public art, where the goal is for people in the general public to see it. This is, I think, a very powerful piece, which is just called Politicians Discussing Global Warming, right? Pretty clear point there, but I think very creatively rendered. This is an interesting piece of participatory art by NELE AZEVEDO, which is essentially where they created these molds of that they produced these ice sculptures, which the public then put what they wanted on the steps of the Capitol in Vermont, and you watched as these sculptures melted away on the steps, right? And it's very much participatory. If you watch a video of it, you can hear that it's a whole group of people are there engaging with it, thinking about it, and watching it as it occurs. You can also have graffiti art. I've already talked about BANKSY and some of the work that he has done. So here we see I don't believe in global warming, right? Now, very often it's harder to find climate art that's optimistic, but I think that it's also really important to think about the two sides of climate art. One is the idea of looking at this dangerous and scary future to warn us away from that, but also trying to think about what types of utopias could we seek, what types of positive things could we pursue. And this is a piece of art by Olafur Eliasson, I'm not sure if I said that correctly, which is called The Weather Project. And this is partially something that he's done to try and promote providing access to solar lighting, particularly in countries that don't have an energy grid. So the idea that we can use solar to make these resources available to people and also do it in a green, environmentally friendly way. And the piece of art that was done here to sort of promote this idea was a solar-powered piece of light that was indoors that was designed to look like a sun, and he put mist in that room to create this view that looked like a sun, and people could come in and sit and bask in the sun and enjoy it and lie there and enjoy that glow. So you know, that's an example of a positive, inspiring piece of art. Another piece of art that I think is kind of interesting to look at, and this is again a participatory piece of art, is a piece of art that was done at Burning Man, where it's called The Long View, and we see a polar bear sort of looking out over the audience. And you know, this is a piece of art that was put together by a large group of people, right? So it was done as an action that many people could contribute to, and to some extent, as you look at how artists do things, they will often have motivations and approaches that you don't necessarily think of at the beginning. For example, for these artists made the polar bear actually out of the hoods of cars. So talking there about the relationship between climate change and the car's transportation that produces the climate impact, right, within the sculpture itself. And you wouldn't see that just by looking at the sculpture itself. But then the idea that this art then goes around and is used as a platform for talking about climate change is sort of connected and key to that, the explanation for why that project exists. I also want to highlight the ways in which climate art is done by activists, by the public, the general public, and often done through protests. So here's a piece of student art that I think is very powerful, and it's students who are standing on pieces of ice that are melting with nooses around their neck. So intended to be a very strong, clear protest around climate risk. There's a prominent protest movement called Extinction Rebellion, and a major component to Extinction Rebellion and the protests they have is the artwork that they're sponsoring. And they're really trying to essentially crowdsource artwork to support these ideas. So here we see people coming together to produce produce change, to inspire that change, right? And here we see another piece of art inspiring people to join the rebellion and try and push back against climate change, right? So there's many different ways that people can produce these ephemeral pieces of art to try and say something about where we're at and what we're facing. Another type of art that we see here is, for example, is performance art. So this is a Red Brigade that often goes ahead of Extinction Rebellion protests. So they will travel and they'll move in a very slow, methodical, and deliberate manner. And they're very striking visually. And there's discussion of how it creates a certain mindfulness around this. And also, interestingly, how having them at the front of protests very often influences the way that the protest interacts with the police and moderates that interaction. So, and also the sort of visual striking element of this and the creepiness of it in some ways, but also the mournfulness of that action is also part of that performance and expression. So this is just a talk, generally speaking, about the idea of democratizing art, that we don't want to think about art as being entirely separate from us as individuals. It should be something that we should understand that we can interact with, that we can have an opinion about, that we can create ourselves. And that doing so is very much a political act, and it respects that there is a way for us to build a creative future together and share our imaginations. So thank you very much for listening, everyone, and take care.